Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next session from our friends at Heartset, Ryan and Khalil, who have some very helpful information uh, this month on harm reduction. And so, without taking many more of their time, I'm just going to turn it right over to them. Hello, everybody. Keep logging in.
Thanks so much, Laura. Hello, folks. Good to be with you again, or for the first time if you haven't been with us the last few months. Um, I'll do our quick spiel and then jump into it. I'm Ryan. I use they and them pronouns, and I'm one of the co-founder trainers for Heartset Training Center. And so we get to do this work all the time, which is talk to folks in communities across the country about housing first practices and other supportive housing practices. We talk about harm reduction and trauma-informed care and many other sort of concepts that we think are integral to supportive housing settings. So this month, we are going to dive into harm reduction, and in particular, this concept of harm reduction in the therapeutic alliance. Um, did want to kind of give an indicator, though, that even if you're like very familiar with harm reduction, we think you're going to find some of this first session, this first week of this three-part series, useful. And also, it is a somewhat sort of 101 foundation of harm reduction. So we want to lay the groundwork for later sessions today. So let me kick it over to my co-presenter, Khalil, to introduce himself.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon. My name is Khalil Martin. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I exist in the mental health world. I'm a therapist right now. Really appreciate substance use and mental health and homelessness spaces as well. So yeah, excited to talk about harm reduction.
Awesome. Some quick expectations that we wanted to share about this session, that things you can expect from us and how we'll expect your engagement. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your perspective, especially if harm reduction is newer for you. Some of these ideas may be strange, or maybe we're framing substance use and risk behavior in ways that are less common. So we hope that you'll engage with that. And if you're a harm reduction veteran, we would love to hear your perspective too. We think harm reduction is quite nuanced, and we think folks from a broad range of backgrounds and perspectives have something to add to this conversation. So we'll engage with you. We'll ask some rhetorical questions. We'll ask some direct questions to get you typing in the chat and see what your thoughts are. But we just hope you'll engage. Sometimes you're not going to agree with what we have to say. We have found that harm reduction can feel a little bit provocative. And we want you to understand that we think a range of approaches to substance use and risk behaviors is good and helpful. What our aim is to provide space and support to folks all across the spectrum of services and needs. And we think harm reduction is an important part of that. So if you're in conflict with some of the ideas that we present today, we think that's okay. And we want to hear your perspective too. That's okay too. So just inviting participation, even if it feels a little bit more intense or at odds with your personal or professional perspective. Sometimes with this tight hour-and-a-half window, we'll move us along just for the sake of getting to all of our content and laying the groundwork that we want to lay for future sessions. So please don't take offense to that if we shut down what feels like a good conversation. It will only be because we're intending to kind of continue to move us through this journey today. And then finally, we are going to offer a link to a session eval at the end of this session. There are two evaluations. The Coalition for the Homeless and Laura have a session evaluation of their own, and then we at Heartset have our own session evaluation. So there's two evaluations. If you complete ours, that'll entitle you to get an attendance certificate, which gets generated automatically, and we'll also send out copies of our materials over email following the session. So you can look out for that. All right, here's what we're going to cover, what we hope that you'll get from our session today. By the end of this session, this hour-and-a-half long session, we hope you'll be able to explain the importance of ensuring safety and upholding bodily autonomy as the foundational aim of our work in harm reduction. Those two main principles we think are underlie a lot of what harm reduction is really all about: safety and bodily autonomy. We also hope you'll be able to describe the impact of stigma on folks with homelessness histories or unstable housing who are also perhaps using substances or engaging in other risk behaviors. So stigma as a really key and centralizing factor for why harm reduction is what it is and what it needs to be. And then lastly, we hope you'll be able to identify some personal use of harm reduction practices. We think that everybody who's with us today is already doing something along the lines of harm reduction. And so we want to extend that idea to the work that we do with the folks that we serve. Here's how we're going to get there today. Here's our agenda. Doing some welcoming and intros now. And we're going to invite you to kind of explore a small check-in activity with us. We're going to define what harm reduction actually is. And in that definition of harm reduction, we'll start to dive deeper in the subsequent sessions in the subsequent sections of how we prioritize bodily autonomy and what does it look like to prioritize safety. We'll then spend a little bit of time unpacking some assumptions about harm reduction. We think there's a lot of negativity. That's not how I want to say that. We think there are misunderstandings about harm reduction floating around out there. And so we want to clear some of that up. Then we'll move on to some question and answer and next steps. So that's our plan for today. That's how we're going to get there. Excited to jump into it. So the first thing I wanted you to do is go on a little journey with me. I want you to kind of imagine in your mind's eye a scenario, right? I want you to imagine that here in the year 2025, all of a sudden, somebody invented a tool that we could use that we embedded deeply into our lives, right? It was a tool that was so useful. It could help us with our relaxation. It could provide some fun and pleasure. It would enable us almost as if it was a disability accommodation or something, right? It would enable us to explore social time in broader ways. It could sometimes help us cope with difficult circumstances. We know that people with other disabilities would benefit from the use of this tool. And even this would be such an important invention and tool that it would become embedded as a cultural tradition, right? Imagine like these rites of passage moving from youth into adulthood, right? There are sometimes these milestone moments. And this tool that was invented, this imaginary tool that I'm suggesting, would be a part of that rite of passage to move into adulthood. That sounds like a pretty cool tool, right? I don't know that anybody would say no to a tool like that if it was so useful, right? But there is an impact to using this imaginary tool. Imagine over 42,000 people died while using this activity or this tool every year, right? And this is just here in our country. Imagine also that an additional 1.6 million people would get hurt. They wouldn't die, but they would get hurt using this tool every year. Imagine that over 7,000 people, 7,500 people every year would die, even if they weren't using this tool themselves, right? They were just like sort of passively affected by other people's use of this tool. And imagine that over 4 million incidences of property damage would also occur from people using this tool. So here's the picture that I'm trying to paint. There's this really incredibly useful tool, right? And it's useful in the sense that it meets a lot of our core needs. But it also comes with some downside, right? And so what I'd like for you to do in the chat, give me your risk assessment, right? And what I mean is on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being very unlikely and 10 being very likely, what is the likelihood that you would use this tool on a scale of 1 to 10? Looking at the pros and cons, right? We know it does a bunch of good for us. We know it's embedded deeply into our society, so there's value there. But we also know that it comes with risk. You could be one of those people that die using that tool. You could hurt other people using that tool, right? So on a scale of 1 to 10, what is the likelihood, just from what you know right now, that you would use that tool? I see one indicator in the chat, a 5. So kind of right in the middle. a 4, so less likely than not to use this tool, right? Not quite as not past the 50% mark for Madison, right? Monique, a lot of people right in the middle, right? Okay, they're coming in. Laura saying a 3. Not very likely would Laura use this tool, knowing the impact, right? And I think that's what folks are sitting with right now. If anybody who already gave their answer wants to also give their some background thoughts about what they were thinking, please feel free. So RC is assuming that the tool is either alcohol or narcotics. So with alcohol, not a teetotaler. With narcotics, only with a medical provider's instructions. RC, I think that is perceptive to assume that it might be a tool that you're already aware of, but back off from that assumption just for a moment and see it as like a risk calculus, right? As a risk calculus, knowing the benefits and the negatives about it, what's the likelihood that you would use it on a 1 to 10 scale? And if it's helpful to kind of assume it's one of those things, fine. But what's your number is my real question. And as RC is thinking and putting their number in the chat, I'll just kind of highlight again that there is nobody that is beyond a 5 on this scale so far, right? Okay, let me cut to the chase. The reality is that the item I'm describing is a car, right? So those statistics that I mentioned are from the last year, or maybe from the last couple of years here in the United States and our car use. And so the purpose of this kind of imaginary thing is that there comes a risk in our lives all the time. But with risk, we get to meet some of our personal needs and goals, right? And so we're always engaging in a risk calculus, whether it's conscious or not. And sometimes we are at the wrong end of the stick with some of that risk. Maybe we're one of those 42,000 people that dies using a car every year. And yet it's almost necessary in our society and our culture to cope, to get to work, right? To meet our survival needs, etc. And so just want to kind of lay the groundwork for a discussion that we're going to get into with Khalil on the next um, slide, that risk is really what we're here to talk about as we start to explore harm reduction, right? So Khalil, I'll pass it to you. You can take it away.
Alrighty. So if we can get some, no, Ryan, take this away. If we could get some more engagement in the chat, I'm curious about for folks in this space, maybe why do you engage in risky behaviors? We love to talk about the risky behaviors of our participants and our clients, but why do you do the things you do that are a little risky? You don't have to tell us what they are, right? But maybe tell us your why. Why do you engage in things that come with some risk? Like driving a car, maybe is a good example, right? What do folks got? We'll give it a little bit of time and then we'll push forward. I have to get to work in other places, Monique says. So, oh wait, was that to this? I'm naturally a cautious person, not a big risk taker. Oh, I see. So things like convenience might be why we engage in risky behaviors, that's for sure. If the benefit outweighs the risk, we might. Yes, absolutely. I know someone who went skydiving for their birthday last year, and that comes with some risk, right? But it also sounds like they had a lot of fun and were weighing the pros and cons of that. Yeah, Ryan asked, what about things other than cars? And if it is easier to think about participants, maybe we think about it in that way. Why do your participants engage in risky behaviors? Alrighty, folks. Well, I'm wondering if anybody engages in risky behaviors like a drink at the end of your workday or your work week to do things like relax and unwind, right? We can put these on the screen now, I am. Or do we engage in substance use or other risky behaviors in social settings? There's also folks who engage as a result of family traditions and spiritual rituals, right? There might be some cultural components here. Because it's fun and pleasurable, right? We've all been young or are young, right? And there are things that just feel good to us. Um, and then we also have these last three that folks are typically naming pretty easily when it comes to thinking about our client population. These last three bullet points really revolve around the idea of coping, right? So to deal with emotional or physical pain, to disconnect, or to make difficult circumstances more tolerable. Yeah. And there's a good comment in the chat that says some of these don't feel risky. And we'll talk about the idea of stigma playing a role in how we label and how we approach risk behaviors as well. Because it's not true that our lives are without risk behaviors as providers, but the behaviors that our participants are engaging in are probably a little more stigmatized than the risk behaviors that we are engaging in, right? And that maybe being the only difference or the only significant difference. So it's important to know that we all do it. These things on the screen are going to feel like those things that feel, oh, this is a little less risky, right? Or because they are so just ingrained in our day to day. So things that we don't even think about, probably like driving the speed limit or putting on our seatbelt, are attempts to reduce harm, right? We don't always know that harm will come when we get in the car, but we know that that is a potential risk, right? We have cigarette smoking on here. We know a lot of recovery centers and rehabs have like smoking designated areas, right? While folks are moving through an addiction to maybe a narcotic or another substance, maybe cigarette smoking is helpful for them, right? I also think about even the filters that are built into cigarettes being a form of harm reduction, right? So that you are not inhaling and ingesting all of the chemicals that are in cigarettes, but less of those, I guess. We have sunscreen on here as a good example of harm reduction. The sun can do some pretty gnarly things to our skin. And then we have helmets and condoms as well, right? Some really easy and understandable kind of tools for harm reduction. These things, they reduce harm, but can't necessarily stop it completely, right? So harm reduction entails having honest and direct conversations with folks about their goals, right? Not everybody's interested in achieving total abstinence or pursuing recovery ever. So we might want to learn how to have conversations about what we might do to reduce risk and harm. If you're going to use, are you using on your own? Are you using alone, right? Some more kind of public health examples of harm reduction that maybe feels a little closer to our work might be the idea of a syringe exchange program, an SEP. Philadelphia has one here that does pretty well. Sometimes they have days where you can exchange like one used syringe for one clean and sterile syringe. Other times they say, hey, just drop us off what you have as a way of collecting and cleaning up these works from the street, but also in distributing sterile and clean tools for folks to use for their substance use, right? If someone's not willing to stop at all, that might be something that keeps them a little more safe if they're going to continue to use. Alrighty. It's also important to know that I talked about a very like public health example of harm reduction just now. But harm reduction does not have its roots in these spaces, right? What I like to say is people have been keeping one another alive in their own communities and the communities of people they love and care about since they've had to. So some examples of that are the first one here is we have the Black Panther Party had a free breakfast program for children in the 1960s and 70s, right? And this was really criminalized, right? The police were after these free breakfast programs. They canvassed neighborhood, knocked on folks' doors and said, don't let your children eat breakfast here. They're going to make your children racist, right? Before the free breakfast program pioneered by the Black Panthers in Chicago opened up. The police again got in there. They like urinated on what was going to be that community's first free breakfast, right? So there's a lot of attempts at not letting these things fly and not letting them make it into the community. And I think the big picture here and the big takeaway is that historically, efforts like this were not necessarily legal or accepted by our government or by dominant culture at all. They were maybe a little more radical, but did maybe pave the way to some larger movements. And like today, we know that free breakfast is something that is offered in all public schools, right? And that has its roots here. But some other examples of harm reduction throughout history include the Young Lords Acupuncture Program. This was for folks using opioids. Folks in this community taught one another how to do acupuncture to fight the challenges of withdrawal. There's also a moment in time where the Young Lords kind of overtook a hospital and got the care they needed for their communities. That's really cool. There's like a New York Times documentary about that. It's very short on YouTube. And then also the reproductive rights and women's health movements in the 1970s, feminist activism, and of course, communities banding together during the HIV and AIDS crisis in the 80s, right? To, again, have access to clean supplies, healthcare, and really social support from there in their communities. And what's important to know is that these didn't come from social workers, right? This came from community members and people who saw a need and did what they could to meet that need.
Yeah, I also wanted to call out here related to the 80s and the HIV and AIDS crisis, a lot of what we understand or what most people think of as harm reduction in terms of syringe exchange services and programs comes from that period, right? Where syringe use and making sure folks had clean and new syringes every time that they injected in order to avoid AIDS, HIV and AIDS. That kind of is still with us, right? And in fact, Philadelphia's syringe program that opened in the early 90s, that was one of the kind of main driving factors behind opening that service in Philadelphia, was to decrease transmission of HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis. And it has done that job quite well. So that legacy, I think, still lives with us. So thinking a little bit more about what harm reduction is, we want to kind of distinguish that there are like two ways that people often use the word harm reduction, and want to outline what those are. Number one, when we use the words harm reduction, sometimes what we mean is the movement, right? And so here's a quote kind of from the National Harm Reduction Coalition: "A movement for social justice built on a belief in and respect for the rights of people who use drugs," right? So social justice at its root, attempting to make sure that drug users are not othered simply for the use of their drugs, right? And so as a social movement, you would see the sort of activism that you would see in any social movement, right? And the kind of language that is attached to social justice movements in general. On the other hand, we also have the sort of practice of harm reduction, which Khalil called a little bit earlier, kind of like the public health examples, right? Some of the stuff we saw on the screens earlier. And it's those practical strategies that we use to try and reduce the negative consequences associated with drug use. And I'll expand that to say associated with risk behavior broadly, right? Once again, this language comes from the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And if you go visit their website, you'll find that they're very focused on drug users, which is great and important. And so here, for the first time in this training, I want to kind of allow us to understand that when we talk about harm reduction, Khalil and I really are talking, and supportive housing settings especially, we're really talking about risk behavior broadly, right? And so we don't just mean drug users. We also mean folks with mental health challenges and other disabilities. We mean folks who are doing a range of illicit activities for survival, sex work being one of those things, right? Self-harm as a method of coping could be something that we might approach a harm reduction perspective to, right? So anything that, when there is an abstinence-based approach, we think there is room for a harm reduction approach as well, right? And so meeting people where they're at, prioritizing health and wellness for every person at all times, and really refusing to perpetuate stigma and cultural norms that often, and this is important, we'll dig into this, these things leave people isolated and alone and ashamed. And so we're really going to talk more about that piece of it here in a moment. I want to just state very plainly here that from our perspective, there are two main goals to using harm reduction as an approach, especially in the supportive housing settings. Number one is we want to keep people safe, right? When people engage in risk behavior, one of the fallouts from that, one of the consequences from that is a decrease in their safety, right? Up to and including death, like loss of life. And it's very easy to conceptualize that from like an injection drug use perspective. So a person can overdose if they're an injection drug user. But there are a range of sort of safety implications when people engage in risk behavior. As we mentioned, when you drive your car, your safety is at risk, right? You could get hit by somebody else in their car. You could get sleepy and fall asleep at the wheel. You could get a text message that pops up on your phone and causes a safety challenge there, right? So safety is one of the main goals of harm reduction, finding ways to stay safer, like wearing a seatbelt. Does that reduce all of the risk that's possible? No, but it is going to keep you some degree safer than not having a seatbelt, right? And then the second main goal is bodily autonomy. And so trying to balance these can be tough, right? We want people to stay safe, but we want people to also be able to make choices for their own lives and with their own bodies. And that self-determination, we think, is part of sort of living a life of both health and dignity, right? Being able to make choices for ourselves is maybe in my estimation one of the most important things that we can have as people, and so we want to extend that to the folks that we're working with, the ability to self-determine their lives. Here want to kind of just I'll go through this really quickly, but a set of principles that we think, if we say that we want to do harm reduction, how do we know we're actually doing it? And I think if you're bringing an intervention to the table that meets as many of these principles as possible, I think we're on the right track, right? So focus on people's health and dignity and self-determination. Being participant or patient-centered, which is easy to say. We all say that we're participant-centered. But for the purpose of this training series, what we really mean is that therapeutic alliance is like almost the most important thing that we can do when we intervene with folks, right? Doing things to support the therapeutic rapport and alliance. Participant involvement, participant self-rule. They get to make the choices about their care and about the rest of their life, right? We get to bring options. They get to make the decision. Understanding the impact of inequality and injustice. And I want to kind of call out Laura's comment in the chat earlier. Some of these don't feel risky, Laura had said. And I think that's true. And Khalil mentioned that, well, stigma plays a role there, right? And so we perceive risk differently depending on who is doing the risky behavior and what they're responding to. And so inequality and injustice plays a pretty big role in terms of what we see as risk behavior, who's allowed to engage in risk behavior, and more. Practical and realistic, our harm reduction strategies and tools have to be something that somebody will actually use. If not, it's useless. And then lastly, accountability without termination. And we're going to dig so much further into that in our next couple sessions. But essentially, we're not firing people for engaging in risk behavior, right? From treatment, they get to stay in treatment. They get to continue receiving support from us. And that doesn't mean that there's no accountability. And again, we'll dig into that a little bit more. Okay, so those are the harm reduction principles. This next section, we're going to kind of break down the first of those two main goals that we said, which is bodily autonomy. And so I'll kick it over to you, Khalil.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So what we're going to do now is throw up some statements on the screen. And typically we ask folks to think about how true this is for you and yourself. But I think for today, we just want to name these things as things that we all probably can agree that we might want or deserve or be able to do in our lives. So the first one says that I'm an expert on myself. For anybody trying to move toward a more harm reduction oriented framework toward working with our participants, it's going to be super necessary to understand and to affirm and acknowledge that clients are the undisputed experts on themselves. The next one says that I determine my life's outcome. We'd ideally love to be determining where our life goes and what comes up for us and how we get there. We can choose to engage in high-risk behaviors if we'd like to, right? This is something that we can choose to do and also choose not to do. And I deserve love and respect. So these are things, is there one more here, Ryan, or that's the last one? And okay, and we also want to be hopeful, right, for our futures. And again, what's important to know here is that these are the things that we want or would like to want for ourselves, right? And that same kind of framework can and should be provided to our participants and the clients that we work with. It's also important to know that we all do this thing, right, called risk. We all have our own risk behaviors that we don't share with people, or that are a little quieter or less stigmatized maybe than the behaviors that our participants are engaging in. But we know that taking risks help us survive, right? If you think about any major transition in your life, it probably came with some risk, right? If you went to school, if you've moved away from home, if you've gotten a new job or quit a job, right? All these things come with some potential risk that hopefully lead to some benefit later down the road. Engaging in risky behaviors is part of being human. It's how we learn, how we grow. I think we've talked about that. We do them. And harm reduction really centers autonomy, choice, and self-determination. So sometimes our participants are engaging in behaviors that we might actually feel some disappointment about. We might not be super happy that they're choosing to do the things that they do. But if we turn our eyes toward self-determination and want to really affirm somebody's autonomy and ability to choose for themselves, it might look like shifting our framework to understanding that participants and the folks that we work with are doing the best things that they can do for themselves in that given moment with current tools, current situation. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on some of what Khalil said, risk is good, actually, right? Which feels weird to say if you plug in injection drug use as the risky behavior.
Mhm.
But the process, the emotional process that undergirds that risk is one that, in fact, helps us, right? Helps us grow. And so, what I'm not saying is that, like, hey, injection drug use helps you grow and evolve as a person. No, but I think we can sort of align ourselves with the understanding that risk is a quite natural and typical human um, endeavor. And I think we should place all of the risky behaviors on the same spectrum. Are some things more risky than others? Yes. And yet there is an element of dignity in being able to choose risk. And that's what we want to extend to our participants.
Alrighty. So we're moving on to our section on safety now. We talked about bodily autonomy and what that means. We're going to talk about some things that kind of generally make our participants unsafe and how we might be able to approach that through Just the idea of understanding things like stigma, shame, and stress. So what you'll notice here, yeah, we can put them all up, that the things on the left um, are the reasons we have to engage in the act of stigmatizing somebody, right? If I can make someone different than me, um, the result of that is I can keep people out. I don't have to let them in. I don't have to be vulnerable. I don't have to accept a way of life for somebody else that seems really scary and threatening to me, right? Stigma also signals danger to our brain, right? And when we can identify something as dangerous, we're able to keep people away. Um, and then I think in a really big way, stigmatization is fueled by discrimination, right? And sometimes we unknowingly kind of want that, right? If we can keep these people on the street, that means I have a home, right? Or if we can keep these people from making this amount of money, that means I have more and will continue to have more and grow, right? So we say that to say that stigma serves a purpose, right? It helps us to keep people out, away, and down, and kind of maintains the status quo when we can continue moving as normal. Anything to add here, Ryan?
Yeah, there's like I would butcher the stat if I tried to say it, but I recall reading a research paper within the last couple of years that said that mental health providers, in fact, were the folks who are um, most likely to hold the highest stigma towards people experiencing mental health challenges, right,
Mm,
as compared with the general population. And I'm saying that to say that I know it can feel a little basic to sort of talk about stigma, right? We work in supportive housing settings with folks with mental health challenges and substance use settings. And I bet you're the person in your life who is most frequently talking about stigma to the other people in your life, right? Uh, and yet, I want us to hold this fact that we all live with bias, unconscious and conscious. And here, what I want to say is that risk behavior and drug use behavior in particular um, carry a lot of stigma, right? I know, which sounds very obvious. Um, and just because we sort of understand what stigma is doesn't mean that we're immune from perpetuating it. And that's why we're hammering so hard on this today. So stigma sort of operates in a bit of a cycle that we want to explain. Um, and it's pretty damaging to folks, right? So imagine a person who uses drugs, right? We know that there is stigma around people who use drugs. So that's number one on the cycle on the left side there, right? There's already stigma around people who use drugs. And some of that stigma comes with stereotypes and labels about people, right? So if I'm a drug user, the stereotype might be that I'm a drug user. Sorry, that I'm a criminal, that I'm lazy, right? That I don't want anything better for my life, that I just want handouts. Like there's all this sort of these negative stereotypes and labels. Well, that also comes with a range of expectations and roles that are expected of me, right? If I'm a drug user who is stereotyped to be a criminal and lazy, I bet I'm going to be given fewer opportunities, right? I'm going to be expected to steal to meet my drug habit. I bet people are not going to see me as dependable. And so those limited opportunities, think about if you owned a shop, right? And you saw me walk in looking for a job and you perceived me to be a drug user. Would you offer me that job? Probably not. You'd think I'm going to steal from you. I'm going to steal from the register. I'm not going to show up. I'm going to call out a lot. Um, and so fewer opportunities are extended to people who are faced with this sort of stigma, which does a number on our own self-worth, right? As people who experience stigma, those folks start to internalize all of this sort of negative understanding of themselves that the world is pushing, right? Or that society or other people are pushing. Right? So those beliefs become internalized, and I might say to myself, I am worthless. I am just a thief who is lazy. I don't care about myself. And what am I going to do to sort of cope with those feelings? I'm probably going to use drugs to cope with those feelings, which just keeps this cycle going, right? I think stigma also sort of perpetuates these abstinence only ideas, which is that when people attempt to get sober or attempt to um, get off of whatever risk behavior that you're doing, um, we already know that sort of like addictive behaviors are cyclical. We know that people are going to relapse, and that's a very typical and natural part of the recovery process. But when we explore addiction and risk behaviors through an abstinence only approach, um, every time I relapse feels like a failure, right? And so that cycle of stigma gets deeper. I keep digging a deeper and deeper trench for my own self worth and my own hope in my ability to recover long term. Um, yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say here. So I'll pass it over to you, Khalil, where we start to talk a little bit about shame and stress.
So thanks, Ryan. So shame and stress are another thing that can make us and our participants feel unsafe in our lives. Um, it's important to know that shame is built into our culture. If you think about just like very young, some of the language that we use with like children and young folks, we tell people to like not cry, right? Or to not be a girl, things like this, right? Um, but and that continues, right? Well into our adult lives. We hear things like that, and then we build like new and kind of damaging associations to a lot of the things: food, clothing, who we are. Um, so we've been doing it a lot. We've been engaging with shame for a lot of our lives. And one of the things we know is that when somebody is down and out, maybe experiencing one of the lowest moments of their lives, to remind them of the shame or to heap on some more, right, isn't actually helpful, right? Because our participants know when they've made a mistake because they're likely experiencing some pretty natural consequences, right? And that's what Ryan and I really like to talk about, the idea of natural consequences in the lives of our participants and our clients. I like to say that harm reduction makes our life easier and our participants' life easier, right? Because we don't have to come up with consequences. They are experiencing them already, right? And they're going to learn and they're going to grow because we know that that's what happens when folks engage in risk behaviors, right? That there is some learning there. There is some data to be gathered there. So when folks are already feeling particularly shameful or stressed, it's important that we're able to reaffirm our commitment to support, right? Yes, this thing happened, and yes, you still have support from us and our organization, hopefully, because the last bullet point here says that stressful events maybe don't have to lead to termination, right? We want to work to continue providing services and care for our participants when and if we can without terminating them, right? If you're seeking substance use support, you come to our program and you're still using substances, what sense does it make to terminate you from there, right? For something that maybe we're not doing correctly or doing well or in a way that is helpful for you, right? We don't want to terminate you because of that. So we want to be able to handle and hold stressful events in the lives of folks and not be terminating them because of the stressors of addiction and homelessness that might be happening in their life. There's a quote here by Brene Brown that many folks know and love. And she says that shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. And in order for any like helpful work to be happening, a participant likely needs to believe that they do have the ability to change. If you think back to our motivational interviewing training we just had, we talked about measuring and assessing somebody's confidence, right, in their ability to change and to grow. And I think that that's what this looks like. There needs to be something there. And sometimes that starts with us kind of chipping away at maybe what feels most shameful for our participants.
I want to highlight here that what we're not saying is that when somebody engages in a risky behavior or a dangerous behavior or something that they didn't intend to, but they did do, what we're not saying is skip that conversation because we don't want to shame them, right? It is very possible to have a conversation about risk behavior that is not shaming in nature, right? I'm still here. I'm still walking alongside you. Let's talk about what happened and how it affected you. That's very different than saying, see, I told you so, or we never should have done X, Y, and Z, or gonna have to take away some privileges until, right? Those are different types of conversations. And so I'm going to be very clear here that harm reduction is not intending to sort of like skip over hard conversations, but we do them in a way that is non-judgmental in nature because we're walking alongside people, right? And that's how we reaffirm our commitment to support. And so shame also shows up in a cycle that I want to outline here. And it's very similar to the stigma cycle, but when a person feels shame, they tend to go back to those coping skills that they know well, right? Which are often risky behaviors. So when I feel a sense of shame about who I am or what I bring to the table, I'm probably going to use drugs, right? Um, because I need a release, right? And so that drug use gives me that very temporary sense of release. Um, and then what happens is I receive more of that shame, right? Externally, my behavior gets criticized. I can't believe you did that again, or I can't believe you're still here, um, out in that truck yard under a tarp, right? Still using when you could be bettering your life. And that criticism, that finger wagging, right? And it is sometimes nuanced between having a conversation with somebody and actually finger wagging at them in a metaphorical sense. Um, that criticism leads me to feel more shame, which leads me to sort of try and find another release, which is probably going to be more risky behavior, right? So, a key that I want to focus on here is that when our folks engage in unsafe behaviors, and that's the only like lens that we approach them through. Oh my God, don't do that. That's unsafe. You cannot do that behavior. You're going to hurt yourself. I'm so worried about you. Even when it comes from a good place, that doesn't necessarily decrease shame and stigma, right? What is going to decrease shame and stigma are going to be um, connection to people, right? Connection to support, openness and transparency so that we can actually have hard conversations about ways to help keep you safe, right? And so when we shame, we decrease connection, we decrease community, we decrease um, health, essentially. And so, yes, we're focused on safety, but we're also focused on that increased connection. RC, I see your comment in the chat. Would this chart be similar to the cycle of abuse, honeymoon, tension buildup, and repeat in domestic violence? RC, I don't have very much experience working in DV or IPV settings, but as I'm just reading the words on the screen, it does sound a bit similar, right? Yeah, and I would guess that there is a sense of shame that plays a role in IPV settings, right? Where um, I'm too ashamed to leave this damaging experience. And so I make up with the person again. I don't know. I'm just spitballing, RC. It's not my area. I don't know. Do you have anything to add there, Khalil? Is that a familiar cycle to you?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add, but I think yeah, the inner workings of these relationships can likely feel very shameful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and might even be considered like a risk behavior, the idea of like engaging in like a relationship that is abusive,
Mm-hmm.
which I think adds another layer here in us understanding like, it's not so simple as like I make a choice to do something hard and now my life is bad, right? There's a ton that goes into these ideas and experiences for folks.
Yeah, which is why it's so deflating for like a provider, for example, to say, "Why don't you just make this change?" Right? You're obviously being harmed by this risk behavior. Why don't you just change? Right? And it's so much more complex for the person than that. It's tied into their sense of self-worth and their coping skills and the way that they get release. Um, yeah, it's tough. It's sticky. Um, All right. I want to move into talking just briefly about trauma, and we'll unpack this a little bit more next session. But I wanted to share with you that there is a relationship between risk behavior and trauma. So, really quickly to kind of set the groundwork here, a traumatic event, here's a quick and dirty. I don't know why I always say that. It's a terrible phrase. Here is a very short definition of trauma or a traumatic event. It's an event in which a person feels terrified and helpless. In other words, they experience a loss of safety and a loss of control, which feels so relevant to me when I think about risk behavior, right? Um, and the goals of harm reduction being to increase safety and to increase bodily autonomy, right? So responsive to trauma that it's almost like a one-to-one. We want people to feel more in control of their bodies and their lives, and we want to increase their safety. And so, in that way, we think harm reduction is a very clear match with folks who have experienced trauma. So, this relationship between traumatic exposure and subsequent health risk behaviors is documented pretty well in research literature. Typically, when people experience trauma, they turn to health risk behaviors to cope with that trauma. And so that relationship is like quite well documented in research. And I'm sure you've seen that in your practices kind of anecdotally, right? Um, and so what? What do we do about that, right? Okay, it's obvious. Somebody experiences trauma, they turn to health risk behaviors. How do we respond as a provider, right? And so to me, one very small and opening answer to that question is if we can start to conceptualize risky behaviors as responses to trauma, right? Oh, they're shooting dope. I wonder if they've experienced trauma, right? If you can sort of start to make it formulaic in our minds that we understand that as a response to trauma, what we have the opportunity to do is set up some systems in our programs and in our direct work with people for greater safety. And we can normalize those responses, right? So that we're interrupting those cycles of shame and stigma. Hey, I understand that you're responding to this. That's very typical and normal. Let me talk to you about what trauma is and see if that lands for you at all, right? Or maybe we can do some safety planning around triggering events, right? It gives us more tools at our disposal to respond as opposed to ignoring the impact of trauma on risk behaviors, which I've seen and is all too common, right? Yes, drug use can be very harmful for people, but to sort of ignore the fact that it's interwoven with people's trauma really does a disservice, I think, to seeing people as whole people, like the holistic care that we hope to provide, right? And of course, we know when trauma goes unaddressed, that increases the risk of mental health and substance use disorders. There's like a pretty well-defined research literature there too, right? So it just makes sense to me to allow us to understand this relationship between risk and trauma so that we can get a fuller picture of what people are actually experiencing. Here's just a kind of graphical depiction of that same concept that I shared. For us as providers, we often see high risk behavior at the surface level. It's quite easy to see something that seems dangerous. If a person is going out um, on dates to solicit, right, for survival purposes, um, and they're not telling their friends where they're going. They're out there all alone. They're doing it late at nights in parts of town that are not safe. It'd be very easy for us as a provider to look at that situation and say, whoa, that's a high risk behavior. Don't do that, right? A harm reduction lens, though, allows us to understand that high risk behavior is tied to trauma very frequently. And so it must be a survival tool of some kind, or it is likely to be a survival tool. And if we know that a high risk behavior is a survival tool, it can change our whole approach, right? Because then we start to dig beneath the surface. There is something that this person is surviving, whether that be trauma or ongoing circumstances. And maybe that is where we focus our attention, right? So this understanding of the relationship between risk and trauma just allows us to take our magnifying glass and put it in places where it will be more helpful below the surface of these risk behaviors that we see. All righty.
Awesome. So some more audience engagement, I hope. But I'd love for folks to stick in the chat. Tell us some words or thoughts that come to mind when you think about people who use substances. Um, I want to add another piece here. Maybe because you are all in this field doing this work, maybe tell us some things that you hear people say about substance users. This doesn't have to be your own thinking or opinion, but um, what does the community say? What does media say? Right? What do our politicians say about folks who use substances? Go ahead and tell us what some of that looks like here in the chat. We talked a little bit about stigmatization. So I guess the question is, what does that look like? Okay, we have a big one. Losers, waste of oxygen. Yeah, and I think we see that in like where our resources for like care are allocated, right? Do we have support financially to serve these communities in these ways, or do we not? Thanks for sharing that, Laura. What else? What other stigmatizing things do folks say about people who use substances or folks who are homeless, experiencing homelessness? Some people say that people who use substances shouldn't be given help. Yeah, I think I've heard that a lot. And I think if we think back to like the purpose and impact of stigma, um, that idea of a substance, someone who uses substances getting help might mean somebody else who's not using substances doesn't get help, right? And that's maybe where this idea comes from. We shouldn't give them help. We should give other people help who like aren't doing drugs. Absolutely. They should get a job. Yep, this is a good one, Monique. Sometimes it is lazy, right? Oh, I see someone on the corner. They're likely lazy. So this is one that we hear a lot.
Khalil, I wonder if you would mind like sharing. You live in a neighborhood in Philadelphia that also how like there are a bunch of people who are drug users and experiencing homelessness in your neighborhood there,
Mhm.
and I guess I wonder if you could speak to like what the community dynamics are like negatively towards the folks that live in your community specifically.
Yeah, it's interesting. My specific neighborhood is so interesting. It is really like a block by block scenario, which I'm actually imagining most neighborhoods maybe are. Um, I once was on a walk with my dog. It was like pretty cold, and there was like somebody in the community walked past someone experiencing homelessness and then saw like another man on the street. I guess they were friends and they started talking. And the guy who walked past this man experiencing homelessness said, you know, if this cold weather doesn't like fix you up, nothing will. Right. That's what he said, like in his response to seeing this after knowing nothing about this person, why they're sitting on the street, what's going on. It's just like, oh, they have the power, the ability, and the tools to just fix their lives because it's cold outside. Right. Um, yeah,
But they must be making a choice, right? If they're not, they must be choosing this. They must want this for themselves.
right. This person is obviously choosing to be outside right now. Um, so I think that that's some of maybe what I see or what I've observed directly is that idea that Laura says. It's like, oh, losers, waste of oxygen, folks who just don't want anything for themselves and that this is a choice for them. It is, I think, what it maybe looks like in my neighborhood.
Another like layer to that I wanted to add. Sorry if I'm like belaboring this point, but um, it's so interesting the way housed neighbors talk about people who are unhoused but also live in that same neighborhood, right? And in fact, it is likely that housed people see unhoused people and drug users in particular as like good, right? They're just like this other group of people, even though they live literally on people's steps and in backyards and like under bridges and stuff in that same neighborhood. They're not seen as part of the neighborhood. They're seen as like detritus, like added on or trash almost is the way. And so that like level of dehumanizing kind of stigma is very present, I think, in some of those neighborhoods.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, right? But I think the fact of the matter is like we do have neighbors who are experiencing homelessness, right? And not in homes who are like part of our community and in our neighborhoods. Madison makes a good comment here, and maybe this is the way your work roles or your agencies are stigmatized, right? As like giving handouts and enabling. And that's what it looks like to reduce suffering for somebody nowadays, right? Is, oh, we're enabling them because now they have a home. Um, Definitely some stigma there, Madison. And I think again, that is like the deservedness that we assign to like folks using substances and who are experiencing homelessness. Yeah, but some other things we might hear are like maybe they're criminals, they're dirty. We already said they're lazy, they're liars. But yeah, way to go, engaging in some good responses here. So one of the things that we want to do is really in this section is reframe some of these assumptions that we maybe do make. So some 3 takeaways for this specific section on unpacking assumptions. I'll maybe start at the bottom, and that drugs don't always cause harm. Abstinence is one of many possible goals. I think that's a really important one to name in the context of a harm reduction training specifically, is because Ryan says this really well when they say that harm reduction is not a gentle on-ramp to sobriety, right? Or to recovery. We're not engaging in harm reduction because we hope that one day someone will choose to be abstinent. We're reducing harm because we can, and it makes sense, and we know how to do it. And people deserve that, whether or not they're going to pursue recovery or abstinence. I don't know. And then the last thing here says that drugs can meet important needs for people. We know that. We've seen that in like the past decade. Things like cannabis being prescribed to folks, right, and THC. So these things are becoming more evidence-based. Folks are meeting needs for themselves as a result of, or like by way of, engaging in substances. There are typically needs there being met.
I think about this bullet point of drugs don't always cause harm. It's so easy to bring this home when we think about alcohol use, right? Many people go home from their abstinence-based treatment programs, treating people who experience alcohol use disorder, and go home and crack a glass of wine or or a can of beer at home to kind of unwind, right? And so it is true that substances don't always cause harm, and I've certainly known people who have used what are considered hard drugs in more moderate ways, right? And so it is possible to engage in risk behavior that doesn't cause harm, which I think is fascinating to think about, especially in that context of cannabis, being much more open and accepting now, and what's the future of some of that when we think about like therapies now that include MDMA or psilocybin, right? And so we kind of continue to open the doors to ways that drugs actually help, and even like psychiatric medications are a drug of a kind, right? And yet we use them effectively as tools for health. So just interesting to consider.
Okay, so we want to let folks know that some harm reduction do's and don'ts. We'll of course start with the do's. Harm reduction does recognize that people make their own choices based on their options and opinions of what feels right for them in that moment, right? People are doing the best they can with what they have at the current time of whatever decision that they are making. Harm reduction also acknowledges risky behaviors in a way that is non-judgmental, right? Because what we do when we start to judge folks, or we express our shock or our surprise in risk behaviors, is it really limits their ability to continue coming to us with that information. And we want that, because that's the information that's going to support us in walking alongside a client or a participant in reducing harm. We're going to need to know. Harm reduction identifies practical ways of lessening consequences of such behavior. We've talked about the syringe exchange programs, but there are other things also, like not using substances alone, right? Are practical ways of lessening some of the consequences of something like an overdose, right? If I overdose, but someone's here to see that and can get immediate medical attention, or is trained in like overdose reversal, then that is just safer than using on your own. And harm reduction applies to substance use, and we talk about that a lot, but also the mental health space. folks with like pretty significant mental health diagnoses and other behavioral health concerns could also benefit from receiving care through a harm reduction lens and framework. Harm reduction does not mean that anything goes, right? Sometimes that is the idea, because we know that it has this there's like an enabling theme here, right? Like your job is to enable folks, but it doesn't mean anything goes, right? Folks come to your agency and your organization for a specific set of services, I'm assuming. So there's going to come a time when they're not eligible for services anymore or might not be a good fit for the program, right? But the point is we will hopefully have tried to keep them engaged and supported while they were with us in our program. There are also natural consequences, right, to not following program expectations, like a potential discharge or termination. But again, we really want to be working to keep as many folks on board as we can. Yes, and then we don't have an ethics piece in this specific slide deck, but one of the things that we like to talk about when it comes to harm reduction and ethics is that when your own autonomy starts like impacting the way others move around the world or is causing other people's harm is where there might be some additional steps taken that don't feel like they align with a harm reduction framework, right? If your decisions for yourself and your body are impacting other people in close proximity to you in a way that is harmful, is when we start to maybe move away from a harm reduction framework. Harm reduction doesn't endorse or encourage drug use or high-risk behaviors. Nobody in harm reduction space is saying, yay, use fentanyl, use heroin, right? But we do want to remain open and accepting to folks who are telling us that they are doing that and able to support them in the ways that we can. It doesn't exclude or dismiss abstinence-based treatment models as viable options. Harm reductionists should be in a loop about what care options are available for folks so that when folks say, hey, I'm ready to actually pursue recovery, abstinence, sobriety, I think that'd be good for me, that we're able to point them in the appropriate direction. And harm reduction also doesn't attempt to minimize or ignore the harms associated with illicit substance use or other high-risk behaviors, right? We're not saying this thing isn't big, this thing isn't scary, but again, we are keeping an open mind so that folks can continue sharing with us these behaviors that they are engaging in. Now we're moving on to some outcomes and limitations. So the outcomes of harm reduction are that this framework meets needs of people that you work with, many who are engaging in high-risk behaviors, right? And the other kind of major outcome here is that people don't die, right? In substance use space and specifically in harm reduction settings, a phrase you may hear often is like dead people can't recover or dead people don't recover, right? So in keeping folks alive, leaves that as an opportunity for them to continue living and making choices for themselves that they maybe feel good about. The limitations, you'll notice, really revolve around us, what we think and believe, or what dominant culture thinks and believes about harm reduction and our role in the lives of participants engaging in high-risk behaviors. So discomfort with disclosure of risky behaviors, right? If you're not used to having conversations about substance use or sex, this might be something that's a little harder to hold for folks. And you might have that instinctual like, oh no, we don't talk about that here, right? But a harm reduction framework encourages us to be talking about these things and kind of embracing the taboo topics, right? Disparities in lived experience. Sometimes we just might not be able to relate closely enough and might not feel like we have anything to offer. And sometimes our own believability in ourselves to support a participant is felt by the participant, right? So their belief in your ability to help, but also your belief in your ability to help and serve them can be a limitation to providing harm reduction care and services for folks. Preoccupation with criminal activity, right? Oh, is this good? Is this bad? This person did a bad thing. It's illegal. They're doing drugs. Sometimes can be the reason that we avoid harm reduction. And on the participant end can also be a reason that folks are not going to disclose to you right? Because they might not know what's reportable, what's not. So I think being clear about what's reportable and what's not is probably an important way to be like mitigating that idea. And then the savior complex. When we feel like it is our job to save and protect folks using substances and who are experiencing homelessness, we're setting ourselves up for a good amount of hurt, right? We know there are a ton of challenges that come with life in this way. And this is one of the reasons why I say harm reduction makes our lives easier and our participant lives easier. When we know we're not forcing them into decisions that they don't want to make, we can maybe rest a little easier knowing that we've done what we could. And then personal values, right? What we believe about substance use, homelessness, how folks got here might also be a limitation in us providing care that that is more aligned with our harm reduction framework.
Awesome. Just for a brief moment, I want to talk about what harm reduction sort of looks like in practice, specifically for agencies that are like already taking a harm reduction approach. Like we keep saying the word harm reduction over and over again. And I want to give you just a couple of examples, sort of concrete examples of harm reduction in practice, specifically as it relates to drugs that are out there. So we talked already a little bit about syringe service programs. They go under several different names: needs-based syringe services programs, syringe exchange programs, needle exchange programs. These are all the same things. And this also includes secondary exchange. So what I mean by that is when people use syringes, they bring those used syringes back to a syringe services program, and in exchange for the used one, they get a new one, right? And so in that way, they're not continuing to reuse the same syringes. They're not sharing them with their friends, sitting around kind of using them with their friends over and over again. Would be a pretty risky vector for transmission of HIV and hepatitis and other bloodborne pathogens. So that exchange is what is typical for syringe services programs, and the harm reduction agency that I've been associated with here in Philadelphia is actually quite encouraging of secondary exchange. And so what we mean by that is when folks will go and get, sometimes folks will go and comb the streets for many syringes, even the ones that they didn't use themselves, and bring them back for fresh ones, right? For new ones, and then sell those, a buck a pop for a syringe to people who maybe can't make it to the syringe program. And that's good, actually, right? They're making money off of the syringe services program, and harm reduction programs are usually like, fine, that's basically okay, because what that means is they're distributing syringes to people who were not already getting them. And so that secondary exchange is typically kind of low-key approved. Another example of substance use harm reduction practice would be safer smoking supplies. So for folks who smoke drugs, kits like having a stem, a glass pipe that people can use that is more likely to withstand temperatures and pressures. Whereas sometimes folks will use any old thing, metal pipes, foil, glass pipes that break really easily. And those things are likely to cause injury to people's mouths. There is bloodborne pathogen exchange that can happen there when people's lips are burned or cracked, right? And so safer smoking supplies is another example. Overdose education and overdose detection services, and even Narcan or naloxone distribution are a key part of harm reduction, right? Just talking to folks about the risk of overdose, especially at high risk times, like when people are getting out of jail or they've been away for a little while, and their tolerance might be low to the substances that they're accustomed to taking at a certain amount. Providing overdose education, talking to people about not using alone. Also providing test strips, right? Fentanyl and xylazine are the big substances on our streets here in Philadelphia. And there are test strips for these substances, right? So we give these even to folks who are not using opioids, right? I'm not an injection drug user. I just smoke crack. Well, guess what? That crack is likely to be in Philadelphia these days. It's not unlikely for it to be laced with fentanyl or xylazine, right? And so testing drugs of any kind that are obtained on the street is a key overdose prevention strategy and harm reduction strategy. giving folks education about reproductive health and services and supplies. The easy example of this is like condoms in schools. Are we saying, hey, we want every teenager in this school to have sex? No, that's not the message that's being happened. But we understand that people are going to make the choices that they're going to make, and we want them to do it as safely as possible. STI screening and prevention and treatment is included in that. And then finally, basic wound care supplies and services. Having street medicine teams out there combing the streets and providing support to unhoused community members is another key harm reduction strategy. So those are just a few examples of what substance use-based harm reduction can look like, and want to turn very quickly to what do we do in a broader sense when something is risky and we're not sure how to respond. A syringe service program doesn't work for this type of risk behavior that I'm thinking of. And so what do I do? And I think one way that we can look at it is to use this blueprint. And you see the numbers on the screen here. I'll just take them kind of one by one, is we can sort of do some self-assessment for ourselves, as well as apply this to the risk behavior that we're engaging around with our participants. Right? So what's the risky activity and what role does it play in your life? And then we can explore through conversation, what are some ways that folks are already reducing harm related to those activities, to see if there are any gaps there. Is there a point of education that can be brought into play? Well, I get clean syringes every time, and I use clean water for my works, and I'm always using the syringe service program, and whenever the nurse is around, I get wound care. Okay, but are you using alone? Right? There are gaps that we can help fill through overdose prevention, kind of education, other supplies maybe that folks need. We can start to have that conversation. And then we can maybe have a conversation around how folks weigh the risks and decide whether they're going to use this activity or not, right? And we started to do that a little bit um, with the initial example that we talked about in this training around the car, right? There's always going to be a risk calculus that people are engaging in. And when that risk calculus is unconscious, we want to bring that to the surface, right? We want to have an open and transparent conversation about the actual risks that are present, and how people are going to decide what they're going to do with that information. And so that's an open conversation we can have with our participants. And then finally, it might be important for us to examine whether there are specific judgments that are associated with those choices, whether we see that through our program rules or the way staff treat participants, or what people are experiencing externally from our programs, and how we can help interrupt some of that stigma and shame. Finally, in the middle of this screen, you see 3 bullet points: risk setting. And these are kind of a couple of ways to explore or figure out where we can reduce risk, right? And where we can increase safety and autonomy. So we can explore what the risk is, right? What is literally happening here, whether that's drug use or sex work or choosing not to take mental health meds. How is the issue being presented? Are there other sources of harm related to that risk behavior? Is there a risk of overdose, for example? Then we can look at the set. And what we mean by set is the mindset that somebody has when they engage in that risk behavior. Oh, sorry, kitty is getting loud. Um, is somebody anxious before they shoot their drugs, right? It's going to be likely that they do it in a less safe way than otherwise, right? If they were feeling calm and relaxed, right? Or maybe certain feelings trigger that risk behavior. So really understanding people's mindset is a key way that we can explore reducing risk for people. How do we help you settle down? Is there a safety plan that we can bring into place? Are there relaxation techniques that would be useful? Would it be helpful to reach out to support when you feel certain ways, right? And then finally, we can examine the setting that people are engaging in their risk behavior in, thinking about the physical and the social environment. And, is it at home that you're doing this? Is it at work? Is it on the street? Are there people around you, which would increase the risk for you? Are there police around? Are there bystanders? How do you present to people? How do people react to you when they see you? These are all examples of sort of the setting that people are in. And maybe the simplest harm reduction strategy is, hey, don't use your drugs right out on the street. Let's go find a place or a friend that has an apartment, or a safer alleyway, right? There are so many ways to adjust the setting, but that's only going to come out if we're having open conversations about the risk, the set, and the setting. Okay, that I think is most of what we have for you. So let me kind of take us through a quick review and some key takeaways. Oh, do you want to?
Oh, yeah, I can.
Sorry, Khalil, this is for you. Yeah.
No worries. It's important to remember that our participants are the experts on their own lived experiences, and it is our job to honor autonomy, self-determination, and choice here for our folks, right? Just important. Undisputed experts on their own lived experience. It's also important that behaviors and even high-risk behaviors serve a function, right? There are needs being met here. People use drugs for all types of reasons, so it's important to approach this with some curiosity. And we'll talk about how to be curious and exploratory when we talk more about the Therapeutic Alliance. Stigma and shame hurt vulnerable people. They're not helpful. Ryan shared both the stigma and shame cycles. We all are already using harm reduction in our own lives. If we really can take a magnifying glass and look at where we might be able to find some additional examples, maybe even beyond what we talked about today. Harm reduction is a nuanced practice that requires creativity, patience, and empathy. And with harm reduction not being like a specific set of tools all the time, I really appreciate the idea of it being creative, because you can really do a lot, and you probably have to do a lot to think creatively about how to reduce harm or continue to provide services for folks. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. We talked about embracing the taboo kind of areas and topics for folks. And then we could also maybe benefit from redefining success, right? What does success look like if this participant is never housed or is never going to stop using substances? And other small moments we can find to celebrate during our connection or our relationship with our participants.
All right. Want to do some quick logistic stuff, but then I think we have some time for Q&A. We can discuss and dialogue a little bit about harm reduction if that's helpful to you. So I'm dropping a link to our survey in the chat. We would ask that you give us some feedback about this training session and what you're learning or not. And then I'll also give a suggestion that if you're looking for ways to practice harm reduction or bring it into your practice, I want to suggest that you pick one risky behavior and apply it to that blueprint that we shared for your own life and sort of understand your own risk calculus, right? So I'm dropping 2 links in the chat right now. The first one is our evaluation, and the second one is a copy of the blueprint that we had on the previous slide. There we go. So yeah, I'd encourage you to download that and explore what your risk behaviors look like in your own life. Sometimes people share that driving too fast is their risk behavior. Sometimes they share that shopping late at night online is their risk behavior. And we've heard all kinds of wild and fun risk behaviors in these training sessions. So pick your one and apply the blueprint to it and sort of see what that feels like. All right, that's the end of our content. So I'll just open up now. If folks have any questions, we do have a few minutes that we can hang around and answer some questions and dialogue with you about harm reduction if that feels helpful. So I'll stop talking, I'll shut up, and feel free to jump in the chat or raise your hand and we'll try and have some dialogue with you. What is sticking with you? And if you need an overnight to chew on any of this, that's okay too. You don't have to say something here, but we have space, so we'll make it. All right. Not seeing anything come in. Looking forward to a meeting with folks next week. We hope we will see you next week, next Wednesday, same time, same place. And we'll start to explore the Therapeutic Alliance more. So excited about that.
Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody. And I'm going to leave this open for just a couple more minutes to make sure that everybody gets these links.
Thanks, Laura. Ryan, do you see the compliment you got in the chat?
Yes, that's my favorite compliment I've ever received. Let me know, Whitney, if you ever run into a publicist or a producer that's looking for an audiobook narrator. I would love that as a side hustle. All right, folks, have a great rest of your day. I'm going to sign off here. So thank you so much.
Take care.
See you all. Take care.